So, the title of my sermon this morning is, What's All This Blood and Body Talk? Now, we've saved the best for last. For those of you who've been with us the past few weeks, this is the fifth and final sermon in our Keep Church Weird series. We've talked about a lot of the weird stuff that Christians do in worship, and we've saved the best for last. So, some of you may not know that many early Christians were actually accused of being cannibals. And when you read the passage from this morning, when you hear the passage Debbie just read, you can see why that may have been a misunderstanding about those people. And so I wanted to dive into what is communion this morning. And as I was getting ready in a private moment of devotion this morning, I picked up a copy of Thomas Keating's Open Mind, Open Doors, or Open Hearts, and out fell a little booklet that I had apparently ordered about a year and a half ago as I was preparing to come and be the pastor of your church. This is my first pastorate, and so I thought I should maybe read up on what the United Methodists say about communion in case you all ask me any questions, so you think I know what I'm doing. And I found this passage this morning, which I wanted to share with you, because one of the questions that I get asked is, why are there so many different names for communion? Why is it the Eucharist, or the Love Feast, or the Holy Communion, Lord's Supper, Last Supper? What are we even talking about? There's so many different names. And so this is what the United Methodist official stance on that is. Each of these names from the New Testament highlights different meanings of this sacrament. And they also say that sacrament, as I told you, is from the Latin for vow or promise, but also from the Greek word for mystery, which I really liked and didn't know until this morning. So each of these names highlights different meanings of the sacrament. Calling it the Lord's Supper reminds us that Jesus began this sacred meal and is our host at the table whenever we share it. Calling it Holy Communion reminds us that it is an act of the most holy and intimate sharing, making us one with Jesus Christ and part of his body, the church. Calling it the Eucharist, a term taken from the New Testament Greek word meaning thanksgiving, reminds us that giving thanks to God for all that God has done is an essential part of the meal. By using different names, we acknowledge that no single term can contain the rich wealth of meanings in this sacred and mysterious act. You know, this act started thousands of years ago, and the ancient world wasn't like our world today. So if we're going to really understand more about this feast, this Holy Communion, I'd like to dive into today's passage by starting with some historical context. Now, the passage that Debbie read to you is what some commentators call the most disputed passage in the Bible. There are a lot of arguments and opinions about what this means. So before we ask that question, I want to give you a little bit of background. In the text, Jesus mentions people of Exodus eating manna. So let's start there. I don't want to shock anyone too much this morning, but Jesus was not a Christian. Sorry. Jesus was a Jew. He came from the ancient line of the Hebrew people that we read about in what we call the Old Testament, what they call the Hebrew Bible, or the Torah, and the writings of God. The Hebrews were rescued from slavery by Moses in Egypt, and they wandered around for 40 years out in the desert before they finally got to the Promised Land, the land which God had set aside for them, so where they could live and prosper. During that time, before, during, and after that time in the desert, the Hebrew people had a tradition of animal sacrifice. Leviticus 17 details exactly how an animal should be butchered, and blood was absolutely forbidden. So kosher butchering was developed and is still practiced today, and is centered around the principle that no blood remains in the animal, and therefore no person who consumes the animal is ever at any risk of consuming the blood, or drinking the blood. So wasn't it offensive for Jesus to talk about drinking his own blood? Yes, it was. It was offensive then, and it's offensive to us now and to our senses of decency and morality. We don't want to think of a Jesus who's talking about, literally in Greek, the verb to munch or to chew. This is pretty visceral stuff today. But you know, Jesus didn't come to earth to coddle us. He didn't come to make us feel better about ourselves or to make sure we were comfortable. Jesus came to wake us up, to shake us up, and to start a revolution of love. And sometimes you have to shake people at the core where they're most uncomfortable. But back to Jesus' ancestors, our ancestors, the Hebrew or Jewish people. These worshipers burned a portion of each animal on an altar as a gift to God, as a thanksgiving for the blessings that they had received from God. They didn't burn the whole animal when they made the sacrifice, though. One portion was set aside for the priests. I mean, every man's got to eat, right? And the priests were too busy doing the business in the temple to go out and do the hunting and gathering in the fields. So there was a portion for God, a portion for the priest, and a portion that the worshipers kept for themselves. They held a feast within the temple court with their sacrificed animal, and they invited all of their friends. God was also thought to be present at this feast, and they actually believed that the sacrifice on the altar was a way of inviting God's physical spirit into the meat that was burning on the altar. And so God was in that animal, and therefore also in the portion given to the priest and in the portion that the worshipers shared with their friends. As these friends literally ate God together, they left the feast certain of God's physical presence within them. They were God-filled. Isn't that a nice image? God was present, and that type of language, which Jesus uses here in this passage of John, which is so unfamiliar and shocking to us, was actually fairly common to those people. They would understand what it meant to eat God and to be God-filled. But let's fast forward a few years, a few thousand years actually. Verse 52 says that the people started arguing immediately about this passage, about what Jesus meant. And they've been arguing about it ever since. The Messiah that the Jewish people were waiting for was a military ruler, a king. They wanted manna or unleavened bread from God to tide them over until this real Messiah came. They didn't recognize Jesus for who he really was because he wasn't what they expected. Some of his closest friends didn't even seem to get it. They didn't understand his identity. So in order to understand, he asked them to do something. He asked them to eat the bread, to eat the flesh, to drink the wine, to drink the blood. Their belief was born in action, springing out of doing. And John's Gospel is the only one without a description of the Holy Communion. The ceremony that we celebrate once a month here in this church is taken from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they give an account of the last night that Jesus spent with his friends. The words of institution, "Do this in remembrance of me," are not found in John's passage. This is the only section of the Gospel of John that alludes at all to the Eucharist. And that's maybe another reason why it's so highly debated. Instead of recalling that actual night, instead of attempting to recount Jesus' words, John has had 70 years to think about it. And in those 70 years... Sorry. This is exciting stuff, people, I tell you. Another hungry one, I think. No. John's been thinking about what happened on that night for 70 years. And so he isn't trying to recount Jesus' words. He's trying to share with us their meaning, their significance, why it's important that we celebrate. Theologians since John's days, and people ever since Jesus' days, have misunderstood this passage. Some people try to brush it off by claiming that it's all a spiritual metaphor, that Jesus should be our spiritual sustenance. Others take a more literal view, and though I usually fall more closely aligned with those who have a metaphorical reading of the Bible rather than a literal reading of the Bible, today I fall in the camp of those who take this passage literally. I mean, Jesus is pretty clear here and transparent when he says, "I am the bread of life. By eating my flesh and drinking my blood, you enter into me, and I into you." So we have this sacrament, one of only 2 sacraments in the Protestant Church, Holy Communion, an invitation, an opportunity to eat and to drink, to taste and to see and to experience what God is really like, what living and walking with Jesus and having Jesus in us is really like. Not only in a metaphysical, spiritual, or emotional way, but also in a very physical, embodied way. Ancient people didn't have the divorcing of the head and the intellect from the rest of the body that some of us suffer from today in modern society. You know, some Christians think you need to qualify for participation in this sacrament. Catholics require you to be a professing, repentant, active Catholic. The Southern Baptists, where I grew up, insisted that you be baptized. And other branches of our Christian tree hold other requirements and beliefs about this sacrament. But Jesus said that he came for all people. He laid down his life in a painful, bloody, historically documented, real way on the cross at Calvary's Hill, so that we might live a life fully alive, a God-filled life that brings glory and honor to God, not to ourselves. So the United Methodists, along with other Protestant Christians, welcome all to the communion table. You don't have to be anything in particular. You don't have to sign your name on any dotted lines or fulfill any rigorous training or discipline. One of our founders, John Wesley, believed that people could come to faith through the eating of the bread and the drinking from the cup. And today's text seems to support Wesley's notion. I'll give the Catholics credit, though. Even though I can't join in communion during their masses, I love the way that they celebrate Holy Communion every day, multiple times per day in some countries, at every mass, at every chance that they gather. It's as normal as eating, breathing, singing, or praying, other things that we do together. Every person has to eat. And many of us, like those original priests, are too busy hunting and gathering, working and volunteering to take time out for a holy moment to be in communion and connection with God. In this church, we celebrate communion once a month, on the first Sunday of every month. Other churches do it once a quarter or once a year. Yes, it's a special ceremony. It's a weird ritual. It's a sacrament and a thin place where we can actually come into contact directly with God. But it should also be a normal part of our daily life as Christians. Literally, filling ourselves up with God's abundant presence doesn't have to wait until Sunday mornings. We can allow other meals with friends or family to become altars in our daily world. Opportunities to see and taste God and to share God with those around us. As we turn our hearts now towards communion, I'd like to invite you to join in another ancient ritual, one that you all used to celebrate here every Sunday when I first became your pastor, the passing of the peace. Oftentimes in the Christian tradition, people say, "The peace of the Lord be with you," or "Peace be with you, God's peace be with you." And the response was, "And also with you." This tradition exists not only in the Christian faith, but also in the Muslim faith and in other faiths, where we greet one another with signs of Christian love. So I'd like to ask you to stand, to speak to those around you, offer a hand, a hug, whatever feels comfortable, and greet one another in Christian fellowship.